I'm very excited to have someone come up to the stage to deliver our keynote. We're going to do it like a fireside chat. He and I are going to have a conversation. I mentioned before that I believe he's one of the most forward thinkers right now when it comes to AI, the future of AI, and the future of work. So I'm very excited to welcome up to the stage managing partner from Omega Venture Partners, Gaurav Tewari. Gaurav, come up on stage. All right. Hey, Gaurav. Good to see you. All right. There we go. All right, so Gaurav, before we jump in, I was when I was getting ready for this, I was looking at your LinkedIn, and I look at a lot of people's LinkedIn, and a lot of people, instead of their title, they'll put some like swanky thing under their name, and they're usually terrible, but I loved yours, so I wrote it down. You said you're an impact investor in iconic companies. And like that just gets to the point. So talk about a little bit your background, who you are, and what Omega Ventures is all about.
Yeah, absolutely, and very pleased to be here. I think the security back there just insisted on making sure I wasn't carrying any medals. But it's really fantastic to be here, and I've been listening in a little bit to some of the sessions that preceded. That was good. So as to myself and Omega, I've been in the technology investment space for almost 20 years at this point. Started my career on the East Coast, and then about 12 years ago moved to Silicon Valley, where I led initially SAP's venture capital group, followed by Citigroup's global tech investing, which was a really interesting experience in seeing both an enterprise software applications vendor on one side with SAP, but also one of large enterprise software technology buyer in Citigroup. And then about 4 years ago, I just felt that the writing was all over the wall, that AI had reached an inflection point in terms of commercial feasibility and technical viability. And that gave me the confidence and the conviction to launch Omega as the first US venture capital fund that's focused on investing in AI for business at the early growth stage. And certainly at that time, I felt we were ahead of the curve. Got a lot of skepticism from a lot of people. COVID hit, everything goes perfectly at critical times. Yeah. And yeah.
We can get you a handheld too if
We'll
that's
get it
easier.
eventually. Is it good? All right. Well, I think it's okay for me. But anyway, so so Omega as a fund, in many ways we were early to market, and but that's turned into a substantial advantage. We, we've had good success so far. We've invested in many companies that have really rapidly emerged to become category leaders in applying AI to deliver real ROI for businesses. We also have a very strong team and platform that consists of experts from MIT and serial entrepreneurs who really help provide and complement the acumen on the team when it comes to separating the wheat from the chaff as we diligence investments, but also in providing the companies that we invest in the type of guidance, resources, support, and capabilities they need to go on and thrive in what we think is an absolutely a generational opportunity for technology value creation and economic growth.
So thank you for that background. And so based on all of that, I mean, you've got a front row seat to what's going on in the industry right now. Can you help us separate a little bit, like where are we in the hype cycle? Separate hype from reality, maybe around AI and specifically Gen AI.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And AI has been an overnight success, 50 years in the making, right? People forget the term AI was coined in 1956 at Dartmouth, and it's kind of had its ups and downs. And certainly we've seen a huge amount of growth in predictive AI, right? And kind of your traditional kind of discriminative AI, which is around classification, prediction, grouping, and followed by a recent surge in generative AI, which has really captured the zeitgeist. And in many ways provided a very positive, what I would call a very, very positive activation energy for AI to be deployed and receive the type of support and dollars necessary to accelerate its advancement. But the short answer to your question is there are absolutely pockets of hype, but there's also very real value being created. When you look at things like Copilot for coding, and I'm sure you're seeing this with some of the Copilots that you alluded to earlier, Adam, the numbers there are undisputable. A typical software developer's productivity is going up anywhere from 30 to 60%.
That's right.
By using the Copilot. And the anecdote you gave of how you started writing Python, that, if you think about it, is a real unlock in human capability. Because now we're no longer constrained by the set of things we know. Our creativity and our persistence is sort of the new limiter on how much we can grow. That's incredibly empowering to us as a society and the world at large. So I think there's absolutely value being created. There's just no doubt about it. You're seeing it in spades in Tungsten. I'm sure with your customers, we've talked about many use cases across our portfolio. And I'll give you an example, because I would give Tungsten's example because they attack core operational workflows that translated to operational efficiency, risk mitigation, and productivity growth. I'll give you a couple of examples of where the hype, it's not just hype, it's real. So one of our companies that we invested in very early on is called Otter, O-T-T-E-R AI, and they started off as a solution for transcribing your meetings. So whether you're meeting on Zoom or in person, everybody hates to take notes, kind of destroys the flow of the conversation in many cases. Well, they said, well, we'll take these notes for you. But what they've really evolved into is your personal knowledge management assistant that can now tell you, well, remind me about all the things, important meetings that I had over the last 6 months where I should be following up, right? And getting to that level of personal intelligent assistance. Or, if your team is using it and you're a sales leader, tell me about all the sales calls that this team of 25 people had over the last quarter. Tell me, which ones led to next steps, which one didn't, and tell me the trends by person. Well, that information can now yield really strong insights. And to me, these are abundant examples of value being, created and realized. Now, to your point, with any rapidly evolving technology, there's certainly hype. And living in Silicon Valley, I feel like we sometimes get overwhelmed by it. And you've all heard about OpenAI raising at $100 billion valuations, and I was just talking to this company yesterday that was formed 6 months ago that's raising at 380 million on a couple of million on ARR. So there's absolutely, I would say there's real value being created from a business perspective, and it is absolutely the right time to adopt these solutions. And because honestly, the companies that adopt these solutions are going to become so competitively differentiated versus the companies that don't. It's going to be like you can't race a jet with a horse and carriage. It just doesn't work. And that's the delta we're talking about here.
Well, you're good at the analogies, because I remember we spoke once and you used some analogy about like stairs and elevators, right? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. And that relates, I think, more to, specifically to what Tungsten is doing really well. I think what has happened in AI, particularly in natural language, right? Because there's different parts of AI. There's vision, and Tungsten has a great portfolio in OCR, optical character recognition, and all that as well. And the analogy I make is that, in the past, you had this approach of predictive AI. Everybody was building better and better staircases. And, certainly for document and content intensive document extraction and workflow automation, Tungsten has been best in class, which is part of the reason why we were so excited to partner with the company when the opportunity came along a couple of years ago. But at the same time, you had this parallel paradigm where everybody was building these staircases. Yes, we've got a great staircase. It's really beautiful. It goes really high up. But now the elevator comes along. And no matter how health conscious you are, you're not going from the ground floor to the 96th floor on stairs. But you can get the best of both worlds if you embrace the elevator, which is this rapid enhancement in speed and capability, but still recognize that, you know what, there's going to be people who want to go from 32 to 33, and they'll take the stairs. What does that mean? It means generative AI, while it's fast, it's leapfrogged a lot of the staircases, there are still, especially for enterprises, accuracy, transparency, reliability, being able to work for your use cases is paramount. And that's where I think you are doing a great job in leveraging the power of those stairs, kind of like helping people go from 32 to 33, where they don't want to wait for an elevator, and they can do it much better versus while still embracing the elevator.
Right. Well, I should have mentioned
It's a
before.
very tortured analogy, I feel like.
No, I love the analogy. You made me think that I need to take more stairs. But I should have mentioned earlier, we're going to open it up at the end of this for questions. Gaurav has graciously offered to take questions. So write down and think about what you might want to ask, and we'll have a microphone roving around. So Gaurav, as technologists, I think we get excited about a lot of this stuff. And you're right. I think this time just feels like it's moving fast, that there's real opportunity there. But at the end of the day, we have to cut through cool and cut through the technology. There needs to be real value. So like a CEO or a CIO, like where should they begin? How should they begin thinking about how to drive real value with this technology in their organization?
Yeah, and so first of all, I mean, I think the analogy I made with the, you cannot compete, you're not going to win a race against a jet plane with a horse and carriage. I really don't think that is at all an over-dramatization. If you think about the internet, if you were a pre-internet business and you were competing with a business that was online and connected, it was just, you're playing a different game. Even in the cloud, and I had a sort of a front row seat to this at SAP, the on-premise vendors weren't necessarily able to adapt to the cloud, right? And so you had the rise of massive companies in the cloud. I mean, just look at Salesforce and ServiceNow, et cetera. Arguably, all took advantage of the fact that SAP as a company was slower to adopt the cloud than it could have been. And so I think change is difficult, but change is real, and it's the key to remaining relevant in this new era that we're finding ourselves in. So I think it starts with this understanding the importance of it. I think a lot of folks have, and that's what I meant by activation energy, because the fact that you can go to a website and experience what this generative AI looks like and just how good it has become really allows the boardroom down, this conversation to percolate from the boardroom down, right? And that creates an impetus and energy, which is very positive. Now, I think in terms of where do you get the value, you really have to look at what is my business objective and think about ROI. I mean, I joke, when we started Omega, I bought the domain name AIwithroi.com, which we still own and still points to our website. But the whole point was, it's not about the technology, it's technology that solves your problem. And your problem in a way that either makes things more accurate, so it mitigates risk, it makes things faster and higher scalability, so it increases efficiency and productivity, it makes things less error prone, it makes your processes more resilient, and it ultimately, as a technology, it gives you organizational and competitive edge in your marketplace. So I think it has to start with a business case predicated around ROI. And then in terms of actually rolling out these initiatives, there's a couple of pillars that are really important, right? So having the right data, having the right skills, that's table stakes. Unfortunately, they're not always a given, right? A lot of companies, a lot of very big companies have siloed data. And so I do think, to some extent, you've got to separate the grand strategy from, well, what are specific use cases, specific pain points that I can get my arms around in a reasonable amount of time, deploy, implement, iterate, test, socialize, and cultivate the skills around the table to be able to work with them. Ultimately, this done properly, this gives your people, or any enterprise's employees, the ability to become Iron Men or women, right? What that means is put the suit on and you've got superpowers. That's a far cry from some of the dystopian science fiction we see typically, but that's what this is. This is about giving you the superpower to learn Python. It's about giving a business executive the superpower to now have at the tip of their fingers relevant insights based on data that they're processing that in the old world might have taken 4 to 6 weeks to get to them, by which time they were irrelevant. Can somebody get me a glass of water, by the way, if that's okay? If that's possible? I'm sorry.
Okay. So we'll get to dystopian science fiction in just a moment, but you mentioned ROI. You mentioned ROI several times. And so how does one, this is one of the things I struggle with, frankly. So we're doing some of these things. How do you measure ROI in a Gen AI tool? And it might be different if you roll it out internally versus externally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it can be hard, but and for example, it depends on the use case. I'll give you an example. We're seeing a lot of companies adopt AI for customer service. Much thanks. Where one of the things generative AI is rather good at is driving interaction, right? So this ability to have an intelligent chatbot or agent on your website that can answer questions 24/7, even basic questions, right? Like with banks, you often see, people want to just get informational stuff, like what time are you open? What's the closest branch to me? And then, the second level questions. So in that cases, we're seeing folks measure ROI by things like, mean time to resolution, savings in your agent's utilization, improvements in your net promoter score, which, by the way, is a key measure of customer retention, loyalty, and experience
satisfaction. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then in other use cases, it's about how much am I able to do? Like, in the specific, for example, in some of the use cases, one of the beautiful things is some of the use cases Tungsten does, whether it's credit monitoring, invoice processing, loan underwriting, lending decisions. These are incredibly quantifiable because you can quantify, am I getting better results relative to the risk I'm taking? Am I able to make my customers happier because they understand policies better? Am I able to do a better job reconciling invoices so I avoid duplicates, wrong payments, errors, and also manage my working capital effectively? And am I doing this with the level of staffing and either with this getting more volume for the same staffing or able to do equivalent volumes with reduced operational expense? Those are some of the more tangible measures. I also think there's a subtle aspect to this, which is you are investing in the future, right? So if you look at, by the way, if you just look at why is Microsoft building its own AI model, I think a lot of people might have heard about this. They put in $11 billion, right, into OpenAI. And they've got this, Microsoft is totally exclusive, sort of preferred partnership with OpenAI. Well, why are they building their own large language model? I think it's really because, and by the way, you can take that same thing to other of these cloud infrastructure vendors. A lot of them are, because it's become part of the package that you need to sell. If you can't really sell a car without automatic windows in this day and age, for example, I'm just making a very loose analogy there. But I also think for what it means for your enterprise is that when you're investing in these capabilities, these processes, this discipline, and this technology skill set, and this cultural orientation, you're investing in the future. And that's harder to quantify.
Yeah, absolutely is. So I've got more things that we could talk about, but if anyone thinks of a question, we can start taking them now. Just raise your hand. Someone will come out with a microphone. Anyone have a question? Sorry, it's hard for me to see, but we have some roving microphones. So, okay, you used another term, Gaurav, in a conversation that we had. I write all this stuff down that you say, by the way, because I find it fascinating. So, we talked about that Gen AI is not without its challenges, and you used a great term. You said innovation theater, and I'm curious what that means.
Well, first of all, I'm very flattered. I guess I'll have to be very consistent in what I say. So innovation theater, I mean, we all know it, right? We've all been there. And we've all seen it, which is being, kind of showing activity for the sake of activity. And innovation theater means, for example, we're seeing a lot of haphazard POCs and pilots happening with startup vendors. And, some of these startups have cool solutions. The problem is there's a big chasm between having a feature and being enterprise grade, especially when it comes to AI, because in AI, if you think about the issues of reliability, data leakage, bias, trust, just relevance and reasoning in the AI process itself, the ability to be bespoke to your enterprise context versus a generic context. These are all very important things. They can make the difference between a nonsensical or destructive response or AI output versus a very productive one. And what I mean by innovation theater is we are seeing, particularly in some cases, and just kind of companies just doing a large assortment of POCs and pilots, and that shows activity. But I think going back to your question about how do we think about the returns on this and how CIOs and CEOs go beyond the hype to think about pragmatic implementation, I do think starting with the end in mind, thinking about, well, what business problem am I trying to solve and what solution will allow me to get there in a way that actually works for my business is really critical.
Yeah. So if there's any questions, who's ever out there, just please shout because it's hard to see. So just let me know. Do we have a question? I see a hand.
Hi, folks. Gaurav, thank you so much for joining us. Many of us in the room, as I look around, may have children who are in college or starting their career. Others of us may mentor young people. And when I think about Gen AI and the impact that it will have on society, I wonder if you would encourage young people to pursue careers in Gen AI, and if you could comment on the extent to which you need to be a computer science major or a real techie in order to contribute to the Gen AI revolution the way that many felt you needed to be. If you wanted to go to Silicon Valley and work for a tech startup, you needed to be a computer science guy or gal. Has that changed, and what skills would you encourage young people to pursue?
What a fantastic question, right? This is, and I think about this a lot. I joked with I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I was telling her, I told her a couple of months ago, I said, you know what, I made it through 9th grade without having a computer. And she texts me back, I made it through 4th grade without ChatGPT. The 10-year-old. I was like, great.
Did you get that response in ChatGPT?
I don't know. But so I think, right, the world we're moving into is, and I think, the prior panel said it's not about humans in the loop. My partner, Thomas Malone, he often calls it, he has a different word for it. He says it's not humans in the loop, it's computers in the group. What that means is we're moving towards a world where the most important skill set, I think, for young people is going to be one of orchestration and great communication. So what do I mean by orchestration? It's being able to orchestrate a group of humans and computers to be able to leverage the best of both. Because for the foreseeable future, AI is augmentative. What I mean, it augments human capabilities. There are aspects of certain low-level jobs and tedium, repetitive, predictable work tasks that can and should be automated. These are things that none of us enjoy doing, but we do it every day, right? Crafting the opening and the ending of an email. I mean, I often have the temptation I should just write bullet points. Of course, it's too rude and socially unacceptable, so I can't do that. But or finding data, collecting data. There are all sorts of things we would rather automate and should be automated. It makes people more excited about coming to work, to not have to deal with the drudgery. But I think for young people, it's really important to, think about coordinating these, looking at the world as a paradigm of computers and machines working together, and having the judgment, the judiciousness, and the curiosity and optimism to be able to pick the best from both. A key part of that is communication. So we've all, everyone said that, right? I mean, since I was 5th grader, probably I heard from my dad, communication is key. You've got to be able to communicate well. And even when I was at MIT, Patrick Winston, who was one of the fathers of AI, his sentiment was, he said, Your success at work will be determined by the quality of your ideas and your ability to communicate them effectively, with the second one being far more important than the first. And so why does this matter? Because when you write a prompt, this whole thing called prompt engineering, prompt design, this is communication. This is communicating with the machine. Now, that's also where Tungsten can play a huge role, because you don't want to write an essay every time you want to ask a simple question. You don't want to say, I mean this, but not that. Make sure to do this, but make sure to not do that. Make sure to take into account this context, but omit that context. That's where I think, somebody like Tungsten, which is playing this role of seeing an entire work process, it makes so much sense for them to build that in for all your users, right? And to save them a lot of effort. But that communication skill is important. It is an incredibly optimistic and positive time, because the third major point we touched on is that for the first time, our children are not going to be relegated or limited by what they can learn. First, they were limited by what they learned in school. Now, then YouTube and other things came along, and you could kind of teach yourself other stuff, LinkedIn maybe, right? Well, now they've got access to the world's best expert at their fingertips today, right? Because what are these large language models fundamentally have ingested the sum total of human data available publicly and created and codified those facts internally, right? That's what they've done. If you were a human being, it would take you 100 lifetimes without any sleep, reading 24/7, 365, and memorizing everything that you've read to come to that level of knowledge. Very hard to do. But so I think it's also a game changer. Now, what does that mean? It means we have to teach our children and our grandchildren to be curious, to be willing to take chances, to be able to tolerate failure, but to approach things with optimism, but also skepticism, because in this AI age, as your video pointed out, deep fakes are going to happen. They already are, right? There's people impersonating CEOs of companies in conference calls and asking for wire transfers to be sent with the same face and the same voice. So, I think it also creates challenges, because our ability to separate the fake from the real is really going to be tested here. And regulation will play some role in that, but regulation usually lags. And, so our children, I think, also need to be astute. We need to teach them, trust but verify, and I just think it's a chance where human potential has the ability to transcend a lot of the limitations that we've historically seen, Peter. So that's part of what really excites me. We try to do our role as investors, by the way, by funding companies that are taking an ethical, responsible, and transparent approach towards AI in the workplace. Companies that want to deliver solutions with real value, that do good for their clients, but also do good for society at large. And that's what excites me too, by the way. And the United States is the best place in the world to do it. We're at the forefront of this revolution. There's a whole other dimension where one of our advisors is a very senior individual at the CIA, and one of the things we often talk about is how important it is for the United States to maintain its edge, because these Western values of freedom, individual liberty, democracy, freedom of expression that we take for granted are not taken for granted in a lot of parts of the world. And I think it's important for us to also think about, so we think about that a lot in terms of our responsibility as investors who are shaping the future of innovation. And part of the reason we feel great about companies like Tungsten that have such a robust framework towards ethical AI from the get-go.
Wow. So if there's any more questions, please shout. I think I have one here in the front.
So when I think about the types of AI that are out there, you do a Google search and there's 17 types of AI. So we work on, machine learning, generative AI, reactive AI, computer vision. This maybe goes along with Pete's question. Like, where do you see this going? Convergence, divergence, in what's next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, don't be confused by the terminology. This is all a part of machine learning, right? So this is all, machine learning became deep learning, which is just a fancy way of saying, instead of advanced statistics, we started. So instead of saying, the old way used to be this is a cat, this is not a cat. And I, kind of say that to the computer. Now I just give it a bunch of pictures and say, this is what a cat looks like. Kind of like how you would teach it. So the rules-based approach would be a cat has 4 legs, it has 4, whatever. Describe the 20 things. And that would also describe a raccoon in many cases, and the thing would fail and not work too well. But what we went to is like how you would teach a kid. That's a cat, that's a dog. And kids kind of get that pretty quickly, right? And so and it turns out with massive amounts of computation, that became possible. So don't be confused by the terminology. There's really a couple of pillars here. There's what's called traditional AI, which is really about grouping things into segments. That's often called predictive AI or discriminative AI, right? So that's just saying that if I've got a class and some students are doing well and some students are not doing so well, what are the subtle patterns I can find that data to maybe see, these 7 students also take music after school, or their mothers listened to Mozart when they were 1. Some pattern that may or may not, that could be significant. Generative AI is about creating new content, right? So in response to usually a prompt. But the prompt is a construct, but anyway, it's in response to a prompt. And it can create content that's code, video, text, music, images, and any number of things. Where we're going with this, I think in the near term, you're going to see much more better reasoning and reliability from these models. So what I mean by reasoning is, you've all heard the problem, these models make stuff up when they're not sure, and that's a very disconcerting experience. I think somebody mentioned previously, if you know what you're doing, you can actually test it, and that will continue to be true for some time, by the way. But reasoning means, well, what does the user really mean? If the system knows the prior context of your interactions with it, it kind of knows that when you're asking a question, it might mean something quite different than when I'm asking a question. And so reasoning, and we're seeing this in systems, the state of the art right now is you give a query, behind the scenes, the AI will create a tree. What did the user mean? Assign probabilities, get answers for everyone, and then come up with a composite answer. The second part of this has to do with routing. So, think about us as human beings. When we have a conversation, we listen to a question, that's being asked of us. Or when, let's say, an employee that you're talking to, you ask them a question. Well, the employee their first job is listen carefully, right? It starts with that. If you don't listen, you don't get it. The second thing is understand my intent, right? So, and that's what you often look for in a good employee. And the third, or a research assistant, right? I don't mean, it could be somebody helping you with knowledge work. The third thing they do is go and collect information that would inform the answer. They have some information in their heads that they can use. It might also require Google searches and maybe going to the library. That's routing, retrieval and routing, right? So this is a big deal, because where we're going with retrieval and routing, today these LLMs are trained on a lot of data on the web. Much of it is biased, toxic, hateful, and they put in place all sorts of guide rails to protect the users. That's an expensive undertaking, by the way. And that's, they call it this red teaming, reinforcement learning, but it's expensive. And you probably have all seen New York Times articles about offshore workers being traumatized by some of the content that they had to flag or whatever, maybe. But my point is, it requires a lot of manual effort. So what you're going to start seeing now is much more intelligent routing and retrieving, which is that the AI doesn't necessarily have to rely on what it was trained on the last time this thing was trained. It can also say, well, let me look at the documents that you have. And again, this is a direction that I think, we've talked about at Tungsten, is that a user, you as a user, you have stuff open on your desktop. You might have stuff in your cached files or locally. You might have stuff sitting on SharePoint. There's stuff on the internet, and there's stuff that you've done in the past. Each of these things provides a context window. And when it comes to answering your question, it's important to take all those into account. Right now, ChatGPT cannot take into account the stuff that's sitting in your personal folders, and that's a limitation. You can do it, you can hack it, you can upload stuff. You're not sure if they'll steal it or you reuse it. They probably can't guarantee it. And that's where I think there's a big role to play, by the way, in all seriousness, for companies like Tungsten to enable its customers to embrace the power of AI while putting a lot of these guardrails around it to deploy safe, responsible adoption. And by the way, this is something that I do struggle with, right, with startups, because you have brilliant people, but what are you going to do when it comes to PII, HIPAA compliance, SOC 2, ISO? You know, there's all these things, right? The person who wakes up in Mountain View in their garage and comes up with a great idea often hasn't thought about all that. It takes them 5 years to even get to that level. So I hope I'm answering your question, but I think what's next is, you know, reasoning, routing, retrieving, and increasingly we'll see some more things like ambiguity, you know, handling ambiguity, handling abstractions. This will all happen within the next 18 to 24-ish months. This is not, we're not talking long term. We're on a path to get there.
So when are we all going to have C3PO?
So what do you mean by C3PO? First define C3PO.
I don't know. I just want someone who I can have go do stuff that I don't want to do and just understands, gets me, Gaurav. Someone who gets me.
Oh, good luck. Talk to your wife. Somebody who gets. I mean, well, you're talking about. Look, I mean, I think what you're talking about is you're going to have increasingly intelligent AIs, right? And you're going to start hearing this buzzword pretty soon called large action model, right? So this is also, to your point, this is also near term. Large action model is pretty simple. You've all seen it. Sometimes when you go into these generative AI systems and ask them a question, have you seen, like, it'll go to Bing, especially? That's basically the thing reasoning and being like, okay, I need some information to answer this question that I don't have. Like, what is the price of you know, a lighting fixture on Home Depot right now? If you wanted to ask that question, it would have to do some research and go to Bing. It's performing an action. But actions can be much more sophisticated. They don't have to be super sophisticated because, you know, we want to approach these incrementally, but could they, for example, query one of your databases to get an answer to answer your question and construct an SQL query? So one of the actions might be, you know, you want to know, hey, give me a breakdown of my sales by territory or quota achievement by, you know, sales team for the last quarter. It has to query a database, which means it needs to turn your natural language query into an SQL, hit a database, get the answer back, and reformulate it. So it's performing an action. So we'll see those. But the thing that I don't think we'll see any time in the foreseeable future is this abstract notions of AGI or artificial general intelligence. If you really look very carefully at this, the people who are talking about AGI keep changing the definition of what they mean by AGI. Yeah. So, yeah, sure, at some point they'll arrive at a definition that we can all kind of agree on, but you know, this notion of AI having general capabilities, that is not there for the first. AGI has been 5 years out for the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gaurav. So I think we're running towards, oh, do we have a question? Yeah, sure. One more.
Gen AI is in every industry. It's like impacting everything. What industries do you think are the most important to focus on in the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, so, and I'll talk by industry and use cases. You know, it has to do with which industries have the data, because ultimately these things, you know, you can think of a lot of generative AI getting its knowledge from a lot of digitized data and being able to see this is typically how things interconnect so it can form coherent sentences and narratives. So first of all, it starts with having enough data. So some of the lowest hanging fruit, you know, is sales or marketing and customer service. You know, salespeople, they hate to enter anything in a CRM universally. I've never heard of a salesperson who said, you know, most people hate to do their expense reports universally. And so there's some areas like that where there's just low hanging fruit, where you can have, you know, where an auditor does some of this when the company I referred to earlier, can listen into the salesperson's conversation, figure out what the next steps are, timing, set a reminder, send an email, all that. Great. Sales, customer service, because, you know, staffing up customer service operations is expensive, and if you have spikes in demand, they don't scale well, and customers get annoyed, and the experience can be variable, and the customer service agents have high churn, so there's a lot of cost of training them. So those are some low-hanging use cases. Finance and operations, in fact, is a massive use case that most companies are not addressing in terms of startups, because it's more complicated. It requires integration with things like other systems of record. Also in finance, it turns out being precise and accurate actually sort of matters, as opposed to summarize the gist of the sales call and tell me the next step, right? A little bit more generic. So that's the second part. And then the third part is, I think, software engineering, right? So coding. This is an absolute game changer. I mean, we are seeing there's still a lot of flaws, right? I mean, I'm sure you found this. If you don't know Python, if you don't, like I remember, but the technology is getting a lot better. I tried, just a little anecdote, in December of 2022, I asked ChatGPT to give me the Black-Scholes formula for pricing options. It got the formula wrong. Can you believe it? And I had to plug in my spreadsheet, and I said, this doesn't make any sense. And I was just like, this is nonsense. Now, of course, they made it a lot better. The world is changing every few weeks here. So now, within those use cases, one could ask the question, well, where are those use cases the most important? And so, some of the biggest sectors that we see spending real dollars here are certainly finance, financial services and insurance. Government and DoD, absolute explosion happening there. And part of that is because of national security considerations. Part of it is because just the sheer amount of data that these intelligence agencies have to comb through is mind-boggling and very intense. And and I think they're doing a lot of things right. Another and I think then you start information technology itself. I mean, tech companies themselves are fast adopters, within the IT industry of these solutions. There's a build versus buy bias in many of them that will lead to longer iteration cycles. And then healthcare. Healthcare is one where AI will drive massive impact, but continues to face regulatory hurdles and archaic systems hurdles. We have a company. We were looking at a company. I don't know if you've ever tried to read your health insurance contract. I mean, if you can understand it, kudos. It is hard to understand these things. It's for like really smart people who are educated. It's because not only do you have too much information, the information can also be contradictory. I mean, how is the average person supposed to understand what's covered and what's not covered? It's terrible, right? And it turns out payers have the same problem, right? They deny claims inaccurately, right? They have conflicting opinions internally because the policies were bridged together through archaic processes that run on mainframes that update every X days, and so you have everything is just like very archaic. And so we have this company that basically can take a policy, take a patient's medical record, take the entire database and the data set, and be able to say exactly what's covered, what's not, and also provide very constructive guidance for the future. This is huge. I mean, this needs to happen in the U.S. medical industry. It's just that, what they found is that, number one, the buyers are not always rational. If you tell them, I'll give you $1 if you give me 10 cents, that's not a no-brainer yes, which boggles my mind, but maybe is not surprising, right? It reminds me a little bit of selling into cable companies back in the early, mid-2000s. It was very irrational behavior back then. But I think healthcare has tremendous impact, and it's an area that we're very focused on right now. We also think that if you think about language models, the human DNA is kind of a language in the sense that it's a structured representation of sequences, not unlike computer code or any language on the planet. Our ability to unlock next level treatments, I think, is at a real inflection point. And you've seen, I don't know if you heard about this thing called AlphaFold. So this protein unfolding thing it would take a PhD about 4 years to figure it out how a protein would unfold. Now we've got a program that can do it in seconds. So just as an idea of what a breakthrough that is, I just think there's so much work to be done in the world of personalized medicine, improving the condition of people's lives, not just the insurance hassle, but the real medical treatments and breakthroughs that we're just at the precipice of, which I'm really looking forward to, because I think it'll make the world better for all of us.
Absolutely. So I feel like we could talk for hours. I'm being told we're out of time. So I want to thank the audience for the questions. Gaurav, I want to thank you for the amazing insights and for coming out to LA today. So Gaurav, Tewari, thank you very much.
Thank you.